Hello everybody, my name is Leah Schwartz and I'm a recent graduate from Stony Brook University. I completed my Bachelor of Science degree there. And I'm going to be presenting about work that I did while I was there and that I've continued doing since I've graduated, and I'm working on publishing a paper about this study. So my contact information is provided here on this slide, and I really encourage you all to reach out to me with any comments or ideas you have on ways I can improve this work as I'm publishing this paper. Specifically, I'm going to be talking to you about infanticide and infant mortality in the Milne Edward Sifakas. So who are these Sifakas? They're called Propithecus Edwardsi, and they are a lemur species. They're the second largest lemur. Of course, they live in Madagascar, as all lemurs do. They are female dominant, they live in pretty small groups of about 2 to 9 individuals, and they reach sexual maturity at around 3.5 years old. Both sexes disperse once they reach that sexual maturity if there is no unrelated mate available in their group, so they avoid inbreeding. Their birth season is in June, and they will only have one infant per female, and they will mate in December. Their mating is extremely limited. The females only really are in estrus for 1 to 2 days. So this study is based on the lemurs that, the Sifakas that are in Radomafana National Park. This is a national park that was founded by Dr. Wright, who was shown here, and she started habituating and studying Propithecus edwardsi here in 1986 and has continued doing so and has founded this national park and also a research center called Central Bio. So there's almost 40 years of data on this species. And for my study, I went through different field notebooks and capture logs in order to identify all the individuals that have been observed and their individual life histories. So I was able to identify over 300 individuals among 20 different social groups in 6 different sites. This map here shows 5 of the sites, and Mongavo, the 5th site, is just south of this map. There's a little symbol with a lemur head for the research center, Central Bio, which is kind of where the headquarters are. That's important because most of the studies have only really been done in Kelly, which is the closest site to the research center. And I wanted to expand to all sites that have been observed. And the last demographic study was also from 2009, so I wanted to add an additional 15 years of data. So the first thing I looked at were the causes of infant mortality and how much infant mortality was occurring, and there was almost 50% infant mortality, which is quite high, and this is what we've seen in previous studies of the species. For the causes, there was a lot of unknown causes where we weren't able to identify a specific cause. If I remove those cases, and this is what is shown on this bottom graph, you see that infanticide by far represents most of the cases that have occurred, and accounts for over 60% of the known causes. The second main cause is fusas, which are shown here on the right. They're the main predator of these lemurs. And there's a couple other accidents and cyclones that have killed off the lemurs. So that really high level of infanticide was interesting to me, and I wanted to look more into that. So infanticide is something that occurs where adults of a species killed infants, and usually they are unrelated adults. And there are different reasons for this, or different theories for why this occurs, and this has been seen across all different types of taxa. For mammals, the main hypothesis or theory is that infanticide gives male access to reproductive opportunities faster, and this is called the sexual selection theory. So this was first primarily introduced by Sarah Hardy in her Abu Langer study, which are shown here on the left. It's also been widely studied in lions and other mammal species. In Sarah's study, Dr. Sarah Hardy's study, the females became sexually active 8 days after the infant were killed. And the idea is that if the infant isn't killed, the females of these species have to nurse their offspring for quite some time, and while they're doing that, they're not able to reproduce and have new offspring. So if you have a new individual come into the group, they will kill the offspring of the female so that they could basically quicken up when that female enters estrus, and so that they could reproduce sooner. So according to previous studies, in the Milne Edward Sifakas, infanticide occurs by both males and females when they are immigrating into a new group. So as mentioned, both of these sexes disperse, and when they join a new group, they would often kill the infants there. Interestingly, resident males would not protect the infants from the immigrants, while the breeding females and other females in the group would show aggression towards the immigrants. Now, my hypothesis was that the frequency of the infanticide would change with the age of the mother, and I specifically predicted that older mothers would be better able to protect their offspring from infanticide and would then therefore show lower rates of deaths by infanticide. And I was predicting this possibly because they have experience protecting their young, or they have higher ranks, so they're able to recruit more help, things like that. So for my methods in order to study this, I was able to determine the age of certain individuals. This was either if they were born during the length of the study or based on body size and tooth wear. So those are based on previous research primarily by King, where he was able to determine the age based on wear on their molars. I was able to identify the age of 24 breeding females, and then I split them into different categories, with 4 to 6 being the youngest mothers who are sexually mature but haven't reached their full body size, which occurs at 6. And then the 6 to 18 are the prime mothers, and then the 18 plus mothers are have been labeled dentally senescent in previous studies. And they're shown to have a harder time taking care of their infants, possibly because their teeth are worn down and they can't provide as much nutrition in their milk. The oldest female in the study was 32 years old. And just by looking at the proportion of deaths caused by infanticide for all of these groups, you can see that for the moms that are age 6 to 12, majority of their infants die from infanticides, over 2 times more common than in any of the other groups. So this does support, in a way, my hypothesis that the older females are experiencing less rates of infanticide. They're experiencing the least out of all these categories. But is this because the older females are better able to protect their infants? I first looked at when these immigrations were happening and who was immigrating into these groups. So this chart shows when the immigration happens based on month, and you could see that most of the immigrations have occurred after the after the birthing season in June and right before the mating season. And females only made up about 24% of all of these immigrations, which was interesting because previous studies have reported an almost equal percentage of immigrations between the sexes, and in fact, almost all of the female immigrations that I counted were indeed the ones from earlier years in the study, and in the past decade or two, there haven't been as many. When you look at if infanticide occurs based on when the immigrants come into the groups, it is more likely to happen if they come before the breeding season. And like we saw, most of the immigrations are indeed before the breeding season. So it seems like that is more beneficial for these lemurs. However, even if they came in post the breeding season, so if they came in February, for example, infanticide was still likely to happen. And in total, infanticide occurred in 83% of the cases if infants were present. And the couple cases where infanticide didn't occur when there was an immigrant were kind of outliers and didn't really match up this description So, for example, there was an individual who had dispersed out of his group and then eventually came back to the group, and the infants that were there at the time were his siblings. There were other cases where there were a couple immigrants that came in around the same time period, and one of them would commit infanticide and the other one wouldn't. So in general, though, it was almost every single time that there was an immigrant, there was an infanticide that occurred. So in conclusion, infanticide is the main known cause, and this is really important because this is indeed an endangered species, and this is a natural cause, so we can't really stop them from doing this, but it's important to minimize the other threats that they're facing. Female immigration infanticides were less common than previously reported, and I'm assuming that mothers are unable to protect their young from the infanticide because almost every single time that an immigrant comes into a group, the infants would die. And so I predict really is that the younger mothers are just being targeted more often because of their reproductive value. For next steps, I would like to calculate the interbirth years. Because this is a very seasonal breeder, and the theory with infanticide is that it shortens interbirth periods, and I want to see if this is true, even though there is a seasonality to estrus here, which doesn't really fit the typical theory of sexual selection. Instead, I'm kind of proposing that the immigrants are potentially doing infanticide in order to get the resident breeder out of the group so that they are able to then mate with the opposite breeding sex, and it still is a way to get reproductive access, but slightly different and won't necessarily shorten the interbirth years, is my prediction, and I would like to study that further. So thank you everyone for listening, and these are my acknowledgements.